Dave Talks Comics, Episode 91, Baltimore Comic-Con 2015, Day 2. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, a program on the subjects of comic books and cartoons. Usually this is the part of the program where I talk about how this is a program about comic books and cartoons. But this episode is all about Day 2 of Baltimore Comic-Con 2015, so there's really no need for a spoiler warning, since it's too late for you to go back and experience Baltimore Comic-Con 2015 in any way other than programs like this or maybe blog entries. So anyway, I will be talking about in this episode the panels I attended, the books I bought, the things I saw, and what I ate. So today was the second day of the 2015 Baltimore Comic-Con. I had originally planned to have breakfast at a place in Baltimore, but I don't know, I decided to have breakfast at home. I slept in a little later than I originally intended to, and then it just seemed easier to have breakfast at home, so that's what I did. I didn't leave as early as I had meant to. I guess originally I wanted to get there when the show opened, but I didn't leave home until 9:45, and the show opened at 10. Took me a good 40 minutes, 45 minutes to drive up to, and I parked much closer to the convention center today than I did yesterday. And I paid less, probably because it was a weekend, although I noticed that the parking garages close to the convention center were considerably more expensive. I paid something like $6.75 for my parking spot today, and I'm paying the same thing for tomorrow. And most of the parking garages right near the convention center, I think, said $20 for the day. So I got to the show, I don't know, probably around 10:45, 11, something like that. And I started off by going down to the show floor. I did some bin diving, looked through some dollar books, and I spent quite a while doing that. I spent some time walking around, but I spent a good amount of time digging through some bins, and I bought about 12 books, $1 a piece. Most of these were DC books, a few were Marvel. I picked up a couple issues of New Teen Titans, issues 12 and 13. These are stories I've been wanting to read, and one of my intentions was to buy, the collected editions, start from the beginning of New Teen Titans. But these are stories I wanted to read. There's the 12 is the second part of the, I think, War of the Gods story, and 13 is the beginning of a Doom Patrol related story. I also picked up Marvel Premiere issues 44 and 56. 44 is a spotlight on the Jack of Hearts, who's a favorite of mine ever since I read the Jack of Hearts miniseries way back when it first came out, which was written by Bill Mantlo. And Marvel Premiere number 56, I believe, is a spotlight on Dominic Fortune, who I think that's his first appearance, and he was created by Howard Chaykin. So I haven't read this before, and I think Howard Chaykin has done at least one other Dominic Fortune story, though I'm not terribly familiar. I think like in the 90s, or maybe it was even in the 2000s. Maybe it was just a reprint that I remember from 10 or so years ago. I also bought Marvel 2-in-1 number 100. This was the last issue of Marvel 2-in-1. After that, they started The Thing got his own, because of course Marvel 2-in-1 was a team-up book featuring The Thing and other guest stars. And after issue 100, they started a new book for The Thing just called The Thing. And I don't remember exactly how many issues that lasted. But this one is, it's a double-sized issue. I don't have it right in front of me, but it looked kind of cool. And it kind of reminded me of Marvel 2-in-1 number 50, which I believe is in Fantastic Four Visionaries, the John Byrne Visionaries Volume 0, which is the one where, and I talked about this on an issue of Dave Talks Comics a while back, probably a year and a half ago, where the Thing gets a, what is it he gets? He gets something, he gets a formula that would work on him, but it doesn't work when I say work on him, I mean to reverse the process, to change him back into a normal-looking man. But it won't work. I think this is how it went. It won't work because it's been too long since he changed. And so he goes back in time and meets his self right after he had become the Thing. But his old self doesn't recognize him and doesn't know who he is. And he can't tell him that he's him. And so they end up getting into this big fight, and then it never works, I don't think. But it's a really cool story because the Thing is trying to fix his past, fix things, and which is kind of a recurring theme in the Fantastic Four, that this sort of thing would happen. So let's see, what else? Oh yeah, I picked up Captain America number 287, which is the middle part of that 3-part story where Deathlock comes back from the past. This was when Mike Zeck was drawing it and J.M. DeMatteis was writing it. For some reason, I had the first and the third parts. I thought I had all 3 parts, but when I looked at and this was very useful, my collection, because I've added my entire collection, I have it all, well, just about all of it, on Comic Book DB. And I was able to get a signal on the convention room floor, and so I would look up things to make sure I didn't already have some of these issues. And this was a case where I had issue 286 and 288, the first and third parts of this story, but I didn't have 287, which was weird. So I picked that up. And the other thing that was weird was I thought that for some reason I had it in my mind that this was a 4-part story. And I could have sworn I bought this on eBay years ago, like over 10 years ago, and read it back then. So I don't know why I would be missing the one issue, which leaves me wondering if that issue isn't stuffed into a bag with the other issues, and I just missed it when I was adding all my issues to Comic Book DB, and so maybe this is an extra copy I have now. But I haven't gone into my comic book boxes yet to check and see. I also bought Underworld number 1. This was the first part of a 4-part miniseries, a kind of a crime story from, I think it was 1987. Ernie Colon is the artist on this. I can't remember who the writer is, but it was something that I've seen advertised in comic books I've been reading, because I read all this old stuff. And so I figured they only had the first issue there, so I picked it up. It was $1, so why not? I also bought the first 2 issues of Silver Blade. This was a 12-part series that was drawn by Gene Colan. It was drawn by Gene Colan, and I think it's kind of an adventure story about a guy who's an actor, but who, becomes more than an actor, I think. And I don't know if there's a surrealistic element to it or a fantastical element to it or not. But this is another book that I've seen advertised in comic books that I read. I think when I was reading The Question, the Denny O'Neil, Dennis Cowan story of The Question, their run on The Question. I didn't read the whole thing. I only read the first, I think, 11 or 12 or 13 issues, something like that. But I saw ads for Silverblade in there, and that got me kind of intrigued, and so that's why I picked it up. Well, they didn't have the entire run, but they did have the first 2 issues, so I picked those two up. And actually, the first issue has a poster in it, and the poster is actually still in the comic book. I haven't taken it out or unfolded it to take a look at it, but I believe it's still in there. Let's see. Oh, I picked up Alpha Flight number 21. That's one of those issues of Alpha Flight that I'm missing. I would have picked up the other issues, but they didn't have them there. I picked up Freedom Fighters number 9. I have the first 8 issues of Freedom Fighters. This is the Freedom Fighters run from their original series from the mid-70s. And I picked up Legion of Superheroes number 283. This is an interesting issue. This is the issue that it's a focus on Wildfire. Wildfire, that's his name, right? Yeah, I think that's his name. The guy who has to live in a containment suit because his body has been altered so that it's just energy. And anyway, this issue immediately precedes the Great Darkness saga, which I started to talk about on a recent episode of Dave Talks Comics. I should just start calling them issues because I say that so often. A recent episode of Dave Talks Comics. And the other thing that I think is cool about it is, unfortunately, it's not drawn by either Keith Giffen or Pat Broderick. And I didn't recognize the penciler's name. But the cover is by Jim Aparo, who is, I don't know if he'd done very much on Legion of Superheroes at all. So it's a kind of a cool cover, and it's kind of one of these covers that's it's got a few panels on it. You've got Wildfire in the middle, and you've got, he's blasting energy out, and it's kind of creating these panel borders, and so you've got 4 panels surrounding him. So it's kind of partly for the cover, and partly because it immediately precedes the Great Darkness saga, which I'm currently reading. So that was it for that. Then I went to the first panel that I went to, which was called It's an Ad World. And I will come back to talk about that in a little bit. But basically it was about ads in comic books. In between, immediately following that panel, I decided to stay in the room for the next panel. But in between those panels, I actually talked a little bit. The guy who ran the It's an Ad World panel noticed that I had an issue of Freedom Fighters. And he was asking me about that. And he knew a little bit about the issue or recognized the character on the front who wasn't one of the Freedom Fighters. And then after the panel, one of the people who came in to listen to the next panel was Jack Harris. Now, Jack Harris was an editor at DC, mostly editor and writer at DC from the mid-'70s to the mid-'80s. He did some work after the mid-'80s, but I think it wasn't quite as, he didn't work as much at DC. He had another full-time job, I think. And he pointed out, and the guy who ran the ad panel pointed out the fact that I had an issue of Freedom Fighters. And so Jack Harris came over and he took a look at it, and we looked at the credits, and sure enough, he was the editor on this issue. And so he signed it for me and dated it. There was a spot right there. He said, "Do you want me to sign it?" And I was looking at it because the thing that always drives me crazy about signatures, or the way I see signatures, some people get it, is that, and I think the artists do this more than writers do, is they sign right over the art. It drives me nuts. And so I looked at the title page, which is where the credits were, where his name was among all the other names, and there was a nice big white area at the bottom below the indicia. And so I said, yeah, if you could sign it right there. And so he signed it, and he dated it, and I asked him a couple questions about, because I really wasn't familiar with his name. I'm not familiar with that many editors, especially unless they were also writers, people, like Roy Thomas or some of the other people who've gone on to, who moved from the ranks of editors into the ranks of writers. So the next panel was the Russ Heath Spotlight panel, and once again, I will come back and I will talk about that but basically it was the spotlight on Russ Heath, who is still alive, although he's in his late 80s. Next I went out for lunch. It was 2:30 by then, and I had scouted out before I left the house, the apartment this morning, and I'd found a couple possibilities that weren't that far from the convention center. It was about a 3-block walk from the convention center, and I went to a place called the Maiwand Grill, which was an Afghan restaurant, nothing too fancy. I paid, I think, $13 for my meal. I had chicken tikka kebab, and it was so it was chicken, and there was rice, and there was salad, and there was bread. And they provided some sauce with it, but honestly, the way they cooked the chicken was really good. And it was actually, I was kind of surprised because the bones were still in the chicken. I mean, it's like one big piece of bone. It wasn't like lots of little bits of bone. But, I mean, because they were like big, they weren't cubes, but they were big, pieces of chicken. They weren't like legs or thighs or things like that. But there was little pieces of bone still in there. Each piece of chicken had a piece of bone in it. But it was very good, very tasty. Would definitely recommend it. And it's only 3 blocks from the convention center. So I went back to the convention center. I did some more browsing. I ended up buying 4 more books. I browsed for a while through the Comics for Less booth. I've bought some books from Comics for Less online through Comic Collectors Live. Now, usually on Comic Collectors Live, their books are quite often $1 a piece. These books, the cheapest books they had there were $2 a piece. And I found 4 books that interested me. Those were 2 issues of DC Comics Presents, numbers 61 and 62. These are 61. Actually, I've read this book before, and I have this story in a digest. It's DC Comics Presents is, of course, a Superman team-up book. Superman teaming up with other people. In this case, it's Superman and OMAC, and it's drawn by George Perez. I don't know why I was blanking on that name. It's drawn by George Perez. Like I said, I read it back in the day when it was in a DC, I think, Blue Ribbon Digest or Best of DC Digest. But this is the full-size comic book. And it's a really cool issue from what I remembered. And actually, you know what? Looking at the cover now, I can see it's kind of a riff on the classic Flash of Two Worlds story. Flash number 123, where the first appearance of Jay Garrick, or the first, crossover between Jay Garrick and Barry Allen back in the Silver Age. The way it's done, kind of. The cover I'm talking about, not the story. So that was one. And then DC Comics Presents number 62 is Superman teaming up with the Freedom Fighters, which has a gorgeous cover by Gil Kane, although the interiors are not by Gil Kane. And I haven't read that yet, so I'm not sure how good or bad it is, but I was interested in it because it was the Freedom Fighters. I also picked up New Teen Titans number 15. Now, I mentioned earlier that I picked up New Teen Titans numbers 12 and 13. Now, I don't have number 14, so I may look for that tomorrow, because that's the middle part of the Teen Titans Doom Patrol story. I'm also probably going to look for New Teen Titans number 11, which I think is the first part of that War of the Gods or Clash of the Gods. I think that predated Clash of the Titans, so I doubt there would be any connection between the two of those. Anyway, and the only other book I bought was Legion of Superheroes number 298, and the reason why I picked that up is because that's the issue that had the preview for Amethyst, Princess of Gemworld, which was originally just a 12-issue maxi series, I think they called them back then, which was about a girl who, I think she's like 11 or 12, and she goes through a portal and she winds up in this world where she's now 18, although actually I'm not sure which is, it's kind of this Thor Don Blake thing, which one is the real person? Are they both the real person? And I really don't know because I haven't read it at all. So I bought that primarily for that, but I'll read the Legion of Superheroes story as well, which I believe is drawn by Keith Giffen and, of course, written by Paul Levitz. And I believe that other Legion of Superheroes issue I bought was also written by Paul Levitz. So next, after that, I went to the Silver Age of comic book art panel. This was done by Arlen Schumer. Oh, wait, I don't want to get into this just now. Yeah. So that ran until about... I'll come back and talk about that after I talk about the other two panels. So after that, I that went until about 6:15, 6:30. I think it was supposed to go till 6:15, but there wasn't anybody using the room afterwards, so we went over a little bit. So that went till about 6:30. At that point, the show was closing down at 7 o'clock. Based on my experience yesterday with a lot of people leaving early yesterday, maybe it wouldn't have been the same today because it's Saturday. It was much busier on the show floor today. Much busier. I hope everybody did quite well. You know, all the dealers, the vendors. I didn't spend that much. I think I spent, I spent $20 on comic books. I bought a T-shirt. I bought the Baltimore Comic-Con T-shirt for this year, which it's black and it has the spirit, and which is drawn by because it's the 75th anniversary of the spirit, and it's drawn by Francesco Francavilla, and it looked really nice, and so I got that. They also had some T-shirts for the Baltimore Comic-Con from prior years. I really wish I'd gotten the one for Usagi Yojimbo because that is very nice. They only had it in extra large, and I usually wear medium, so I didn't get it. I think it was only $10. Maybe I should have gotten it anyway. I don't know. Maybe one day it will fit me. And yeah, so that's about it. You know, I left the convention center about 6:30 and walked back to my car and drove home. It was a much smoother drive home. I didn't have to deal with rush hour traffic because it's Saturday. And I probably got home almost an hour earlier than I did yesterday because I left about a half hour earlier. I had a much smoother drive coming home. I think yesterday it took me about an hour to get home, and today it was only about a half hour. And that was even including maybe 40 minutes because I stopped to get gas. But yeah, so I had a great time, and I'm going to come back and talk about the 3 panels. So at 12:15, I went to It's an Ad World Advertising and Comics panel. It was hosted by Ed Cato, who works in advertising and is also a comic book fan. And it was a very visual presentation. He had all kinds of slides, all kinds of pictures of ads in comic books, which is... well, that's what the title of the panel said. And this did not include house ads, so this was outside advertising. And so it was a look back at ads going back to even as far as the Golden Age, but quite often the Bronze Age and the Silver Age. He started off with a image that I was very familiar with, which is ad for this set of Roman soldiers, which he told us was drawn by Russ Heath. And there was another one of Revolutionary soldiers, and actually, I think there was another one it was supposed to be like the Normandy invasion, the D-Day, June 6th, 1944, which I remember getting when I was a kid. My father ordered it for me and my brother, and if I remember correctly, it came in this little box that kind of looked like an army footlocker. But the only thing was that the figures themselves were very flimsy. They were very thin. They were on stands, but they were very thin. They were not nowhere near as durable as like the plastic green army men we would get. They looked a little like them, but like I said, they were very thin and brittle. So getting back to the panel, Ed also showed us, I'm going to go through a bunch of the ads that he showed us and talked about, and maybe I'll remember some of his anecdotes. Captain Action was another one he showed us, and that's basically a 1960s, I would say, toy, which kind of predated my time, but I certainly saw it in some of the comic books that I bought later, back issues from the Silver Age that I bought. He showed us like the quintessential comic book ad page, which was, one of these pages which has all these little ads in it for all kinds of things, including, like spy cameras and X-ray glasses and stink bombs and all sorts of other things, which quite often would overpromise, would make it sound like it would work very easily and it would make your life much easier. He showed us pictures of the ad for the sea monkeys, which were always kind of strange. I was never really sure what exactly you were getting when you ordered sea monkeys, and I don't think we ever ordered sea monkeys when I was a little kid, either myself, or even any of my friends, or if they did, they didn't own up to it. Another thing that was very popular was model kits, and he showed us a bunch of pictures of various model kits. I remember seeing some model kits. I can't remember the name of the company, but I remember there was a lot of ads for, things like ships and planes, usually military ships, military planes, things like that. But he showed us model kits, and I think once again this goes back to the Silver Age for things like monsters like Dracula and Frankenstein. And so some of them were vehicles like UFOs. There was some were of superheroes like Superman and Batman and other non-superhero characters also like Tarzan. There were also ads for systems that were supposed to make you stronger. The typical Charles Atlas ads, which I think they still had back in the early 80s when I was reading comics. I'm not sure when they eventually phased out. Ed, the moderator, also showed us an ad for Joe Weider, who was another one of these people who advertised ways to get stronger, or at least to look better. Look as if you were stronger. There was also ads for fat removers. I don't remember the Joe Weider or the fat remover ads, but I certainly do remember the Charles Atlas ones. Then there were ads for music. There was Marvel albums. Apparently there was a couple of Spider-Man albums. I don't remember that, although I do remember there was there was a music component to the story in Marvel Team Up number 100, the one that featured the first appearance of Karma and was officially Spider-Man teaming up with the Fantastic Four, although Karma is controlling the Fantastic Four, and so Spider-Man ends up fighting the Fantastic Four. But there was oh, you know what? I'm getting confused here. It wasn't Marvel Team Up 100. It was Spider-Man Annual number 14, I believe. And the reason why I was getting confused was they were both drawn by Frank Miller. And yes, but there was a scene at a bar, and there was a band, and there was something in like the letters page about how you could get the single that they played or something like that. Let's see what else. And then there was also ads, and still in that music vein, for 8-track tapes. There were employment ads, something called ICS Diploma. I suppose that's something like a GED. I'm not sure. Ads for other employment, like to become an auto mechanic or a shoe salesman. And of course, you've always got to remember that back then, most of the people reading this were young kids, probably boys, or probably most of them were boys. I'm sure there were girls that read these, but. So some of these you kind of sometimes had to wonder how much thought they put into the way they designed these ads and who they were targeting. Then he got into the weird, what he describes as the weird ads, things like a Venus flytrap, which they said it could eat an insect up to 20 times its size. The giant playform animal collection, the Man from U.N.C.L.E. poster, which I guess he thought was weird. I wasn't entirely sure what was so weird about it. I think it was the way the guy looked. I think sometimes, like I said, once again, you got to remember that the guy who was doing the presentation was in advertising, so he wasn't just looking at the ads themselves, but also looking at them as how effective they might be, or how appropriate they might be, considering who the audience would be. He showed us some pictures of cool toy ads, like ant farms. Now, you see, ant farms, that's something I would think would be more appropriate in the weird category. Shrunken heads, okay, that's definitely weird. And then got in some other toys, like toy cars, Thunderbike, Heroes in Action. Okay, kind of in the weird vein again, or the what were they thinking vein. Then there were ads for guns, BB guns. Now, I certainly remember seeing those ads on the backs of comic books. He even showed us an ad for an automatic firing machine gun. Now, this thing obviously did not fire real bullets, but it fired pellets, and it, that's the sort of thing that just would not fly at all today. Ads for like a Mattel M16. Now, this wasn't a real M16, but it was, and I think I actually saw this when I was a kid. I don't have a clue as to where or when it was, but somebody had one of these. It was, the sort of thing that has, takes batteries, and you pull the trigger and it makes noise like it's shooting, or, and then he showed us this ad where these kids used it wasn't a real gun, but it was a fake gun to fool criminals, and they showed the police congratulating the kids and rewarding the kids for fooling these criminals, and once again, things that just would not go over real well today. Moving on, then he talked a little bit about candy ads, and in this section he primarily focused on Tootsie Roll, and talked about how Tootsie Roll was a long-time sponsor or a long-time advertiser in comic books, and how they would run these stories, Captain Tootsie, and he showed us some of these. Some of them, basically he was encouraging kids to eat candy, that it would help them do this or help them do that. And interesting to note was that some of the early Captain Tootsie ads were drawn by C.C. Beck, who also was the artist for Captain Marvel, the original Captain Marvel, who was later known as Shazam. And you could certainly see some parallels in the design behind Captain Tootsie and Captain Marvel. After this, he kind of got into talking a little bit about, or highlighting, I should say, some of the artists who have done ads that have appeared in cartoons. And these are, of course, comic book artists. People like Kurt Schaffenberger, who did some of the ads for Captain Atom. Jack Kirby, who did ads for Big Jim, which is a toy which I'm pretty sure I had back in the 70s. Joe Kubert, who's done some ads for things like those 12-inch dolls, like Superman. And I had one of those things of one of those G.I. Joe. I had at least one. I think I might have even had two of the G.I. Joe dolls, which were much bigger. And this was before they brought back G.I. Joe in comic books in the early 80s and in cartoons. And Joe Kubert also did ads for Pom Poms, which is a candy, I think. And Ed showed us some pictures of those where they were using dinosaurs and Tarzan in these ads. And then finally, Chris Sprouse did some ads for collector's tins. And I think these were collector's tins. I'm not sure if he was actually doing the art on the tins or if he was doing the advertisements. I mean, based on what the panel's about, I assume it's the advertisements. And then finally, he finally, well, not finally, but one of the last things he got into was the Hostess ads, and showed us some of those classic ads. I have no idea how many there are, and he didn't attempt to enumerate how many there were. But you had ads by Ross Andrew for these were for things like the Hostess fruit pies and Hostess Twinkies and Hostess cupcakes, and there must have been some other things, but those are the ones that I recall. So, as I mentioned, Ross Andrew doing Spider-Man. There was a Captain America Nick Fury ad for Hostess, a Hulk ad which was done by Herb Trimpe. And these ads were, these were like full-page ads, which you can find in comic books like back in the 70s, and I think even in the early 80s. And so it would be like a one-page story, which, the resolution was you should eat Hostess, fruit pies or whatever it was. And he showed us one, Thor fighting space hillbillies, and of course defeats them by using Hostess fruit pies. Batman and Robin, Penguin and Aquaman ads. These are all Hostess ads still by Kurt Swan. And it wasn't just DC and Marvel. It was also Archie got into this with some ads that were drawn by Dan DeCarlo using the Archie characters. There was also ads using the Harvey characters. I think I remember those because I used to read comic books, Harvey comic books at the barber shop. I didn't really buy them myself, and I can't remember my parents ever buying them for me, but I certainly saw them there. Harvey characters, I mean, the most famous Harvey characters, of course, Casper the Friendly Ghost, but there were other characters, there were other ghosts. There was Wendy the Good Witch or something like that. And then he talked a little bit about and showed us some Hostess parody ads that had been done in comic books over the years. And then finally there was a little bit of time left for some Q&A, and the most interesting thing that came up there was a discussion about how now that comic books, with comic books becoming electronic, with Comixology, you don't see the ads. There's no ads in the electronic versions of comic books. And so what's happening to these ads and what will happen, will we see ads showing up again, or how is that going to work? And it was interesting. I'm not completely convinced that ads have completely gone away from in electronic comic books. And I say that because having recently signed up for Hulu puts ads. Even though you're paying for this service and you're getting the service, they have gotten people used to the idea of still watching ads. Now, I hit the mute button when I'm watching Hulu when an ad comes up. Although sometimes I like to hear exactly what they have to say. But if it's something like a car commercial, I'm hitting the mute button. So that was it for it's an ad world, advertising and comics panel. It was more or less what I expected it would be, and it was a nice nostalgic look back at some of these, and also it was kind of cool to be introduced to some of these things that I hadn't seen before, and even have my memory jogged, and I can't think of anything that falls into this category right now, but I believe there was at least a couple things there that I had just completely forgotten about, and when they showed up on the screen, when he described them, they came back to mind. I was like, oh yeah, I remember those ads. But so this was a very cool panel, and I don't know if he does this on a regular basis or if this was the only time he's doing it, but it's definitely worth catching. And I'm not sure if he's somebody who's local to the Baltimore area or to the Maryland area, but definitely worth my time, and a great panel. The second panel that I went to, the Russ Heath Spotlight panel, more or less immediately followed the it's an ad world panel, and I think I talked a little bit already about what happened in between the two panels. The moderator for this panel was Mike Gold. Russ Heath was there, although it should be pointed out that he is old. He's about to turn 89. His hearing is bad. He was having problems with his hearing aids, and his mind seemed to wander a bit. So he would start to answer a question, and then he would get kind of off on a tangent, and then he couldn't remember what the original question was, and there was a fair amount of that during the panel. So in some ways, it would have been great to see this panel probably 5 or 10 years ago, when he was probably in better health and better shape and more lucid than he was today. Mike isn't young himself, but he's certainly not 89. And my guess is he's in his early 60s or something like that. He attempted to, guide the conversation. And he hit on a number of things. He got Russ to talk a little bit about the time that he spent in the Playboy Mansion, because Russ was one of the artists who worked on a book called Trump, which was a book that Hugh Hefner put together that was an attempt at, I think with Harvey Kurtzman, which was an attempt at a more sophisticated adult humor magazine, with cartoons and such. And when I say adult humor, it wasn't all racy. If you know anything, I wouldn't say if you know anything about Hugh Hefner, but one of the things that I do know about Hugh Hefner is that he was, I believe, originally he was interested in becoming a comic book artist, and that was kind of one of those things that he held in a childhood dream that was left unfulfilled, and I think this is probably why he attempted to put this book together, Trump. Anyway, Russ Heath talked a little bit about what it was like living in the Playboy Mansion. He lived there off and on. I guess when he was doing work, he would stay there, he said, from anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. And he said he probably lived there a total of something like a year and a half over the period that he was working on this book. So he talked a little bit about Hugh Hefner. He also talked a little bit about Shel Silverstein. But that was more or less it as far as the Playboy Mansion goes. Mike attempted to get him to talk about DC Comics. He brought up Bob Kanigher, the writer for DC Comics, who wrote a lot of things for DC Comics, including their war books, which was probably the thing that Russ Heath did the most work on at DC, I think. I know he did a lot of work on Our Army at War. He also did a little bit of work on Star Spangled War stories. And I think there's a couple others that are slipping my mind at DC. But Russ Heath didn't really have anything good to say about Bob Kanigher. From the sounds of it, they did not get along. Bob Kanigher was apparently not a very easy person to get along with, and Mike Gold said that as well. He tried to get Russ to talk a little bit about the Sea Devils. He didn't get a whole lot out of him there. Or the Haunted Tank. What he had to say about the Haunted Tank was that he found it to be, and these are my words here, very unimaginative and very repetitive. That it seemed the stories all seemed to be the same. And I guess the reason why Mike brought up the Haunted Tank, or one of the reasons why, was because Russ was the first artist to draw the Haunted Tank. I've read a couple Haunted Tank stories, but not very many. I think I have a few here. And the other thing that came up at this point in the discussion was that Russ mentioned that he doesn't like to draw straight lines. He likes squiggly lines. He likes rubble. He likes war stories because there's a lot fewer straight lines because there's so much rubble. He did talk a little bit about Archie Goodwin. He had a good relationship with Archie Goodwin. And he talked about Jack Harris. Well, actually, Jack Harris is, and I mentioned Jack Harris before because I got him to sign the issue of Freedom Fighters that I bought today. But Jack Harris was there in the front row in the audience, and he apparently he got Russ to draw a Wonder Woman story, or a chapter from a Wonder Woman story, and they tried to get Russ to remember anything about it, but he didn't really remember anything about it. There was a question from the audience about why his work was so detailed, and he said it was because he wanted to be accurate. He didn't want people to come to him and start, saying that doesn't look right, or, whether it was a war story or a Western or whatever. He wanted to get the details correct. And that's part of the reason why he wasn't always the fastest artist. And on the subject of Joe Kubert, whom he worked with, he said that he said it was not easy to ink his work because of the way Joe Kubert drew. He was a much looser artist, and if you know Joe Kubert's work, I think that probably makes sense, especially at that point in his career. And he also said that he thought that Joe Kubert had too much respect or too much reverence, I think was the word he used, for deadlines. Now, I looked back through my collection to see what I had of Russ Heath's work. I knew I had a few war stories, and I do. I have a couple issues of Our Army at War that have stories drawn by him. There was a comic book that I read recently, the Batman Legends of the Dark Knight Annual Number 7, which was a Balloon Buster story, or brought in the Balloon Buster. Which I wasn't really crazy about that book, but it wasn't the art, I don't think. I think it was more the story. He also drew a couple entries in Who's Who, the definitive directory to the DC universe, I think it's the full name. The Golden Gladiator in issue number 9, and the Sea Devils in issue number 20. Now, going back to there's a couple of older things that I have, reprints of older things that I have. He drew an issue of a story in an issue of Frontline Combat. It was a World War I story about an observation, OP, which I believe has always meant observation post. It's basically about some guys in in a trench lines in World War I who were getting overrun, and one of them is trying to call in fire as the enemy's overrunning them, and the other story. There's another story also in Blazing Combat, which was published by Warren Publications in the 4th and final issue of Blazing Combat. It was a World War II story that he drew, which involved a bottle of either wine or champagne, and actually this story came up during the panel. And I had to pull this out when I got home because I couldn't remember the story, or I had vague recollections of the story. When somebody said the story about a champagne, but I really wasn't sure what the story was exactly. So I had to pull it out, and his drawings, both in that and in the Frontline Combat story, are very detailed. He's definitely, and I mean in that Blazing Combat story, the artwork it's beautiful. I mean, the way he draws the faces, I mean, it's almost photographic quality. And so that's about it for the Russ Heath panel. Once again, it was a little sad that he wasn't as with it as would have been nice. We did give him a standing ovation at the end of the panel, and I mean, who knows, how much longer he'll be around, but I'm glad I was there for the panel. Yeah, I wish it'd gone differently. I wish he'd been a little more lucid, but that's what happens. The final panel that I went to was the Silver Age of Comic Book Art panel. This was moderated by Arlen Schumer, whom I have heard a couple times on Word Balloon. Most recently, I think there was an episode from either August or early September that he was on. So if you're interested in hearing him, you might want to look back through the episodes of Word Balloon. I believe the previous time he was on was about this time last year, or maybe over the summer last year. But anyway, he had an audio-visual presentation. He had the lights turned out, so I could not take any notes during this. So the only notes that I've got are the ones that I wrote down after I got home. Basically, what he's done is he has traced the evolution of superheroes during the 1960s. And actually, I should be a little more clear here. He has written a book called The Silver Age of Comic Book Art, which is the same name that he gives to the panel, and he's selling it at the show. And in this book, and the panel basically followed the course of the book. He traces the evolution of superheroes during the 1960s using pictures and words, and so there are actual panels from comic books put together, and so he takes different panels and puts them together to create some very effective to illustrate his points, not just. And so it's very beautiful what he put up on the screen, and of course he's using some great artwork by some great artists, and he focuses on a number of different artists in doing this: Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Gil Kane, Murphy Anderson, Neil Adams. And I'm probably forgetting somebody. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody. Well, he also talked about Carmine Infantino. And if I think of any others before I stop recording, I'll throw the names out there. But basically, he began with the Atom, Ray Palmer, the Silver Age Atom, and he ended with the last issue of Green Lantern that was written and drawn by Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams. And he showed us that image at the beginning, and then basically he started with the Atom, and he ended with the image that he showed us at the beginning, with an image, the image of from Green Lantern. Now his presentation was excellent. I think he is very energetic. He's very excited, which is exactly what I got from his appearances on Word Balloon, which is part of the reason why I wanted to go to this panel. I didn't realize that he had written a book, or if I had heard about it, I had forgotten that he'd written a book called The Silver Age of Comic Book Art. And actually, I think this is a revised edition, so I don't think he may have released this a few years ago, and I'm not sure what he revised. Not all of this information was new to me, probably in part because I'd heard him on Word Balloon, but it was certainly the first time I'd seen it presented so vividly, and so vividly especially because there was images to go along with the words. And that's about it for the presentation. There was a couple questions at the end, but nothing that I recall. I am thinking about buying the book. It retails for $50. I checked on Amazon. You can get it for $40 on Amazon. There's a Kindle version, which is just $10. But this is the sort of thing that I think I might want. I mean, it's all this beautiful art, And he's also doing another panel tomorrow, which I am thinking of going to, and that's a panel on the Spirit, because it's the 75th anniversary of the Spirit. I think they had a panel today on the Spirit, which included Matt Wagner and a couple other people whose names are escaping me right now. But I chose not to go to that. I think I skipped that for the art panel, I think. But the Spirit panel, I think I'm going to go to, and I think it's going to be in an even bigger room tomorrow. It's also a little earlier. This one was the 5:15 panel. A few more notes about the comic books that I bought today. Dominic Fortune, he appears in Marvel Premiere number 56, which I bought, but that was not his first comic book appearance. Well, he'd appeared in comic book magazines before this, but I guess it was his first appearance in a comic book. I don't know. His first appearance was in Marvel Preview number 2, which has a cover date of July 1975. At the same time that he appeared in Marvel Premiere number 56, he was also appearing in a run of issues of the Hulk magazine, issues 21 to 25. And this was in 1980. So this was 5 years after his first appearance. He was created by Howard Chaykin. Howard Chaykin did do another miniseries about him in 2009, which is collected in a trade paperback. Now, he'd appeared a number of times over the years in between 1975 and 2009, or 1980, when that Marvel Premiere issue is from, in 2009. But only on rare occasions was he drawn by Howard Chaykin, and I think that miniseries in 2009 was the first time that Chaykin actually got to write another Dominic Fortune story. The character's most recent appearance is in Avengers 1959, which is from about 3-4 years ago, like end of 2011, early 2012. And I guess it's also worth mentioning that there's more than one Dominic Fortune, and I'm not sure if they're alternate universe, but you can Google this. I found an entry on Wikipedia. I just didn't read it in detail or commit it to memory. On the subject of Marvel 2-in-1, issue number 100 is dated June 1983, and I looked it up, and yes, the Thing comic book series started the next month, July 1983. It lasted for 36 issues, and I haven't checked yet, but I'm pretty sure that issue of Marvel 2-in-1 leads right into that first issue of the Things comic book. Now, I also mentioned issue 50 of Marvel 2-in-1, which was the Thing battling the Thing. Issue 100 is the Thing teaming up with Ben Grimm, but I believe it's an alternate universe Ben Grimm, as opposed to issue 50, where he went back in time and met himself from the same universe. Captain America 287, that's not a duplicate. I don't have that issue. I only have the one copy that I just bought. I'm not sure. I could have sworn that I read this Captain America Deathlock story before in full. So I don't know what happened there. I seriously doubt I would have given that away. So I'm not sure what happened, but I'm glad that I've got the whole story now so I can read it. Jim Aparo and the Legion of Superheroes. Jim Aparo never drew interiors for the Legion of Superheroes, according to Comic Book DB, but he did draw 2 covers himself, and he was one of the pencilers on a third, or one of the artists on a third cover. In addition to 283, which I bought, he also drew the cover to 282, not quite as pretty as the one to 283. And he was also listed as one of a number of cover artists for issue 300. I don't completely understand that. I looked at the cover online. I don't have that issue. I can't figure out, because there's a whole bunch of characters posing there, and I can't figure out if one of them was drawn. I assume that he drew one or more of them, but I couldn't figure out, based on the drawing, which one was his. And finally, Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 14. I talked about that on Dave Talks Comics episode 38. That's it for episode 91 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com and facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter, at Dave Talks Comics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I'll be talking about the third and final day of the 2015 Baltimore Comic-Con. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.